Hello, and we are here with Steve Coffey from Compassion UK. I'm Owen, Creative Director of Upshot, and I've been chatting to a couple of people in the charity sector about branding and marketing and design and getting their thoughts on it. So, Steve, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hello, first and foremost. Does feel a bit strange because we've obviously known each other for a little while. So introducing myself to you is odd, but I'll imagine that I'm talking to all the people watching or listening. But yeah, my name's Steve Coffey, and in terms of introducing myself as it relates to what we're talking about, I suppose I could say, yeah, I've been in the charity sector for about 10 or 11 years, but I've been in marketing, comms, brand, and various different sort of guises for the best part of probably 20 years, I think. Um, Arts marketing initially in Plymouth, where I know you're based, and then into comms agency. So I worked on agency side. And then, yeah, about 11 years ago, switched over into the third sector, was working heading up a comms team there, and responsible for creative delivery. And then I've been at Compassion for about a year now, just over a year. So, yeah, kind of a bit of a split between, the arts and agency side, working with corporates and, in automotive and charity and all sorts. And then yeah, on the sort of client side in the third sector for about 11 years.
Cool. And now you're head of communication and creative delivery at Compassion UK. I think it's worth pointing out from the start, and I'm going to try and remember to do this every time, that this is an interview with Steve Coffey. This isn't an interview with the official perspective of Compassion UK. So anything that Steve says that Compassion, if you guys see this, that you go, hang on, that's not our position. Please do note that this is Steve's own opinions rather than anything else. But tell us about Compassion.
Yeah. So Compassion's been going for decades, was founded by an American, and is the sort of mission of Compassion is to release children from poverty in Jesus' name. So it is a Christian charity, very overtly a Christian charity, and but really focused on releasing children from poverty, and that can be in a number of ways. It's through what we call holistic child development, and so it's tackling kind of child poverty from a number of different angles, often sort of around food, nutrition, and healthcare, through education and so on. And so actually, it's about ensuring that the whole child is kind of catered for and looked after, and enables them to they're released from poverty. And then the knock-on effect of that is what they go on to do in their community immediately. The family are kind of obviously benefit from that, but then it's the ripple effect beyond into the community and into the future. And actually, some of the most amazing stuff. I've met people who are graduates of our programs, and the stories they have are just incredible. They're people that are now, themselves either country directors of ours, so they've gone on to become people that are impacting their communities and releasing other children from poverty, or they're kind of engineers, or they're community workers, or teachers, or people that are running charities. And so it's this amazing ripple effect. You kind of change the life of one child, or help to change the life of one child, and sort of help them fulfill their potential. And this knock-on effect is incredible.
Yeah, that's amazing. Is that something, I suppose, that making a difference that you talk about for that one person that moves on to make a difference for some other people, is that something that particularly resonates with you personally, that makes you want to work in the sector, but also particularly for Compassion?
Yeah, it's all about the money. It's really not all about the money. Yeah, it is. I mean, there's always a danger. Feel free to fire the klaxon if it goes. But there's always a danger of like coming across as like a pretentious do-gooder when you're sort of talking about working in charity and so on.
Yeah.
Because there's always the underlying implication that, I work for a charity. I therefore make a difference, or the charity I work for makes a difference. And obviously that is true. That otherwise, most people that work for charities wouldn't do it. But you need to tackle the underlying assumption that it's just the charities that do that thing and make the difference. And of course, we know that's not true. There are enterprises and corporations and lots of
course.
other organizations that make a difference. But for me personally, in this particular role, yeah, that's a huge motivating factor, because it feels like, you've got a finite number of hours in your day, or you need to work to live. But if you can do that in a way that actually makes a difference somewhere, it kind of improves the community, or improves the lives of a handful of individuals, or it just sort of, I don't know, if you want to get kind of a bit a bit touchy-feely for a bit, if you can kind of shift the dial globally a little bit, if you can just make the world a little bit of a better place in some way. And I think that's part of what our approach is, that obviously we want to have as big an impact as possible, but often people looking at a problem like poverty, or global extreme poverty, which is actually getting worse at the moment because of COVID, people just feel a bit like helpless in the face of that. And that's just one of a number of things like malaria, cancer research, and loads of other sort of issues that are really good to get behind. And people, I think, can feel a bit kind of paralyzed in the face of all the things that need to be done. And so actually it's almost like, well, just focusing on one thing perhaps, or one person, as we would do through the child sponsorship sort of program, so that you can just make a bit of a difference. You haven't got to sort of tackle the whole thing. It's almost just like, well, just do
so what does a communications and creative delivery head do? What's that kind of look like on a day-by-day basis in a charity like Compassion?
It's quite busy and quite varied. I love it. I lead a team, or I lead a few teams, looking after sort of PR, looking after content marketing, that includes social media and so on, and looking after campaigns, and project managing kind of campaigns, whether that's direct mail or email or whatever, to our supporters. And so big part of the role is to sort of oversee or work with the leaders of those teams and help sort of shape that and put it, connect the dots often, and kind of set them going in the right direction, sort of set the overarching vision or strategy, as well as rolling your sleeves up and getting on with some stuff. So yesterday we're doing some filming and doing that, quite hands-on with that, as well as like looking over, we've got a Christmas appeal going through at the moment, and so looking through the kind of proofs of that, having thought through the kind of the brief for it, the vision for it. We've got a campaign coming up, a small campaign coming up in the next couple of weeks around Great Big Green Week and climate change, and how that impacts the children that we serve. So it's really varied, and that's partly why I love it. I mean, the challenge of it sometimes is that you can feel like you're spinning plates, and just moving lots of different things forward a millimeter at a time, hopefully forward rather than backwards. And that's brilliant, because you get the variety and involved in a lot. But one of the things I find when things are busy, my default is almost to go to what I know and what I love. And I love kind of video production and that sort of side of it. And so I can find myself kind of getting too caught up in things like that, which I love and would happily do, hours at a time. So I have to sort of step back and think, actually, no, I need to kind of give equal weighting to all the sort of different things that are taking place. Part of it, as well as it relates to this conversation, is about sort of brand guardianship and development as well. And that's an interesting area at Compassion, because of the fact that we're at such a big global organisation. It's a new challenge for me, having the sort of that scale to deal with, and not necessarily having as much input and control as perhaps I've had in other places too. So that that's
been talking about that. That's a huge challenge for an organisation and their brand when you are part of a bigger network and you're not the head office as well. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand the USA Compassion office is the big dog, and you guys are part of that. That's where you work from. So you've got a certain amount of control brand wise, but you've got to also fit to what they're doing culturally. It's going to be different, visually different cues will work. So how do you address that challenge with Compassion and their brand?
Yeah, well, I mean, first and foremost, I would say that there's always a temptation to think the grass is greener. So where I came from before, it wasn't a small charity by any stretch, but probably by UK standards would be a medium-sized charity.
Mm.
But where I was, we were kind of like the head office really, and so there was much more of the sort of central control, for want of a less sort of cynical term. But you could be tempted to look from that sort of organisation to an organisation like Compassion or someone else and think, well, they've got resources, or the Macmillans of this world, or Cancer Research. I think they've got the financial resources behind to have a fantastic brand, to have that consistency, to put all the money behind it. And then you shift to somewhere that's big and that has perhaps the resources, or more of the resources. I'm not saying I'm not saying we're kind of awash with money and we've got too much to spend or anything, but it's a bigger organization. But actually the challenge there is it's like a tanker, right? You're trying to turn a tank around potentially, or steer a tanker through. You can be less nimble perhaps. But the thing I would say, I really and this is quite a big thing for me in terms of thinking through what brand is and so on, is that what Compassion does brilliantly is, even though it's a global organization that has sort of what we call GPAs, which are kind of like if you like, the fundraising offices around the world, in Australia and Canada and the UK and the US. And then we've got 25 country programs like Kenya and Mexico and so on, where the sort of frontline work takes place. The values of the organization are so well kind of communicated and shared that it feels like one organization. And that's not a given in other organizations that have that sort of global spread. And so the values and cultural attributes of Compassion are crystal clear, but they're not just crystal clear because they're writ large on a wall. There's a really nice poster with the values written on it, which, as we know, it's a bit useless if you've just got it sort of slapped on the wall. If it's not authentic and lived out, then it's a bit pointless. But all those sort of values and cultural attributes are there right at the heart of recruitment. They're at the heart of like performance management and the performance development reviews. They're part of like the rewards and recognition. They're part of the everyday conversations, right from the exec team throughout like all the other teams. It's absolutely lived out, and that for me is a huge part of how Compassion, let alone visual brand and all the sort of like the outworkings of it, how that kind of comes to life and is therefore through everything that Compassion does. And that's what we hear from supporters as well. Supporters and the feedback we get, whether that's on social media or whether it's in like face-to-face groups. And we rely a lot on volunteers. We've got this great army of sort of volunteer speakers, for instance, and we hear it back from them that actually they represent Compassion authentically and in the same way too. It doesn't mean everyone's robots and they're all like Compassion branded and that's it. They're their own people, but actually they have similar values to the organization, and they know what Compassion stands for and how we kind of want to be. And that, I think, is the core underpinning part of any kind of brand conversation, is around who it is who you are as an organization and how authentically you live that out.
Yeah, that brand guardianship is amazing, because those values have to come through every touch point that any person could potentially come across Compassion, right? So they go to something where there's a speaker representing Compassion, and how do you say that's been there all along? Is that something that's just natural when you talk to volunteers or speakers? Do they have to do any research, or is it just something that's naturally part of the conversation, those values?
It's probably a bit of a blend of the two, because in the sense of the natural bit of it has to be there to some degree. It has to be part of the way you talk, even the way you sort of set up to talk to volunteers about values. If you're not doing it in such a way, and the way you communicate with them, then if you're not doing that's authentically, linked to the values and the cultural attributes, it doesn't ring true. So there has to be that sort of natural side of it. But actually, if you've done all the kind of, if you're really mindful about how you recruit people, and actually whether or not someone is able to work, and hold those values and have those same sort of attributes in terms of how they work with one another. If you recruit on that basis and you make sure that you manage people on that basis, then actually people are more naturally likely to live that out themselves anyway. So it's a little bit of the two, but I think you have to be really mindful. And actually, we're very lucky to have in the UK an amazing exec team, and it comes right down from the top in those sorts of things. And I know that not every company or organization has that sort of same thing. And so I appreciate that we're quite lucky in that sense. But actually, that's probably an important part of it, that, like you say, it's every touch point. If it's not, I'm terrible at remembering who to attribute quotes to, but there's that quote, isn't there? Everything you do either builds the brand or erodes the brand. And that includes, how someone answers the phone, or how you might respond to emails, as much as it is what your digi ads look like, or what your kind of press releases, how they're all as important as each other. And so you could have these beautifully heartfelt ads, and actually if someone then calls into the office and they get a terrible experience, or they speak to someone who's just really dismissive and whatever, it's a real clash of the values, really.
And the brand sort of sits at executive level, does it, or does it kind of filter down?
Yeah, there's
challenges there, right?
The challenge. Sorry, go on.
Well, just particularly with the different offices and different levels of even executive is going to be is going to cause a challenge with that. Is that something that you've seen struggles with, either here or in other jobs?
Yeah, I think, and in with sort of connections and friends and whatever, in other parts of either the third sector or even in just in other organisations and companies, is that it's a strange one, because I personally think, obviously, brand is incredibly important, but it's not one person's role. In the same way that I've got creative in my role, but that doesn't mean that everything that's creative comes through me, or that I'm the arbiter of everything creative. It'd be ridiculous. And in that same way, it really depends on how the senior leadership see brand. If people see it as a logo, or like that you're a police officer that is kind of, making sure that the logo doesn't get stretched, or that the color palette isn't messed with, then you're going to have it at sort of middle level, right? And you're going to have someone who's a bit of a bulldog, who can kind of, do the carrot stick stuff with people. And that's going to have limited return. Whereas actually, if it's seen as something that fits across everything, that it plays a part in communications, and it plays a part in design, but that it also plays a part in your HR policies and IT and everything like that. That actually, therefore, it's not that it needs to be a senior position for the sake of it, or I'm not trying to craft a job for myself in like the exec level, but it has to have that seniority about it, just because it fits across so many departments, or it should fit across so many departments. And at Compassion, we, like I say, I think we're lucky to have a chief exec and an exec team that kind of get that. And that place so much importance on the values, and then how that plays out in brand. And so that is probably held at a fairly senior level, which I think is good. I mean, if nothing's perfect, there's always sort of like challenges with it, of course, but I do think that's quite an important thing, that it doesn't just sit with a designer, or doesn't just sit with like a head of comms. It's got to be across the org.
Do you think that there are particular challenges for a charity as opposed to a corporate organisation, business, or something like that when it comes to brand? Because brand has typically been something that is used to drive value, to build profit. Sometimes in the past, that's quite a big corporate priority when it comes to brand. And in the third sector, it's a different environment. It's a different place to be thinking about that. Is there a particular challenge for charities, or a different way of approaching brand, do you think?
Maybe it's not exclusive to charities, but I do think it's keenly felt in charities, because of course you're using supporters' money.
Sure.
And there's always the age-old challenges. Some people would be surprised that people that work in charities are paid, or that. And there's always a live debate about chief executive salaries and so on. And I'm saying all that because there's often a very good and justified scrutiny over spending of charities. You don't want to see a charity that's putting 10% into like the programs they're doing, and the rest of it's into kind of like publicity and acquiring the next sponsor. But you've got to have that balance. And so actually investing, and it is investing money into things like brand, into good design, into communications, into advertising and so on. It's not simply to look good. It's not simply to make everything look pretty. actually what you're doing is you're finding the next supporter, or you're kind of raising your brand profile with a purpose, because you need to meet more of the right people. I think where it's wasteful is where it's not sort of well thought through. It's basically just a scattergun approach of trying to, we want to do something because it's fun, or it looks good, or, it gets in front of lots of different people. And that isn't always the right thing to do. A previous charity I worked at, actually, we were very focused on, we were quite explicit about saying we don't want to be, I think the way we put it was, we don't want to be a household name, we just want to be known in the right households. And we were trying to be very targeted at, this sounds quite cynical, but at ultra high net worth individuals. And that's not just because, they got loads of money. It was more because actually they are, because often they were kind of giving an awful lot of money. This is a very general statement, and I know it's not true for everything, but because they're giving quite large amounts of money, whether they're philanthropists or, a trust or something, they are scrutinizing where that goes. And therefore, and we wanted that. We wanted people who would engage with the issue, because we wanted long-term partnership with them. We didn't just want 1 million people giving £3 a month, although I suppose that in itself throws up challenges. You've then got to equip a supporter experience team that will kind of deal with the inquiries that come from that. And actually, we felt that probably wasn't a smart way to go. And so actually being very targeted about it, and then investing a sensible proportion of the income into things like brand and design and the comms campaigns you might be running, is more about engaging more of the people that you need on board to achieve your mission. And I think as long as that's always the goal, and not just because actually you want to be, having articles written about you in campaign or whatever, then, although that would be great, then I think that's a good way to steer.
Do you ever find that you have to tone back your ideas because of the fact that you're a charity? You've got great big ideas, and you don't think you could get the buy-in for a particularly bold or ambitious plan, or that you're worried that someone might see it as gratuitous or wasteful spending? Is that something that's a real problem that you have to address, or is that just perception?
No, I think that's fair. I think that is fair. I don't think it's unique to charities, but I don't think. But yeah, you've got, if we do a direct mail campaign to supporters to ask them to support our Christmas appeal, which might be about giving an extra gift at Christmas, or writing to a sponsored child at Christmas in particular, if it landed on the doormat and mini pyrotechnics sort of exploded as they opened the envelope, it would get their attention. But then they'd be hot on the phone saying, how much money have you spent on doing this? You just needed to write and ask me to do that, and I would have done it. So it's about being appropriate with it. I mean, there might be times where that pyrotechnics on the doormat might be appropriate. I can't think what they would be, but so you definitely need to rein that in. But that's okay. I think that's why you work, and that's why you need good people on the team, because in those expansive sessions and moments, you can kind of put everything out there and say, what about this? What about this? What about this? By the way, that isn't an idea. I've never floated that. I don't know why that came up, and I would hate for you to think that I was thinking that was a good idea.
That's next week's pitch, is it?
Yeah. If you see that on your doormat next week, then you'll know why. But there are times where it's absolutely appropriate to sort of spend a little bit more, or to to sort of perhaps not go against, but yeah, just do something unusual or unexpected. Actually, sometimes that's entirely appropriate. But it is, you've got to sort of think very carefully about it, because of, the ratio of, I don't want to kind of spend too much on this in terms of what you get back. But I think I've said this to you before. My boss did something very wise to me about a year ago, saying, you should never sort of look to spend less on promoting something than you spent on producing it, because I don't think it necessarily, works in terms of, suddenly we spent X amount on this, we've got to spend exactly the same. But his point is, the principle behind it is, why put something on if it's an event, or if it's a particular kind of, television program like one we're working at the minute? Why spend the money on doing that and then not invest time and money telling people about it, because it's, or, really promoting it, because it's that's part of it. You need to sort of see that as a part of it. Otherwise, it's just sort of, it almost makes the event itself a waste of money, because you've not sort of given it the
missed opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's. Uh, do you kind of then sort of staying on the theme, I suppose, of the temptation to bring big ideas in? Are there big ideas or charity heroes, brand heroes that you look to sometimes and think, oh, I wish we'd done that, or could we possibly do something like this? There's all sorts of charities who've got their own little or big ideas and things that they do, and they rely on that bring in regular income. Is there a bit of a? Do you look elsewhere? Do you look outside of the organisation at the
Yeah.
sector?
Yeah.
Who are the
Yeah.
brand heroes you look up to then?
There are loads. Yeah, definitely look elsewhere. I mean, that's part of what we try and do it. You know, we make it as part of a rhythm of our week. In my team, we've got a creative jam session, which is only a brief thing, which is kind of like you bring. I mean, this is on a low level, right? But we kind of bring ideas, things we've seen, and it might be we've got various categories, but it's not restrictive. But it might be like video, or it might be, you know, out of home campaign. It might be ads you've seen. It could be like a, you know, a thank you email, or kind of a whatever on a website. Anything, any kind of piece of communication that's broadest possible definition that you think is interesting, inspiring, or, you know, perhaps got a direct application for compassion. And we share that with one another. You've got a maximum of a minute because we've got about 15 of us to kind of present.
Mm.
You know, one of us, Rich in my team, has the bell and dings it when we're for a minute. But it's really good because actually what we're just trying to do is just get that discipline of making sure that things are busy, everyone's spinning plates. But if you don't sort of carve out time in your week to stop and look around and be inspired by other charities or other companies, then, you know, you're pretty quickly going to, you know, die off and you won't have the ideas. You've got to sort of, you know, feed your imagination. And even if it isn't sort of like, well, I need to look for something because we've got to come up with a new campaign, so I need to steal that over there.
Mm.
Even if it is just sort of switching your brain mode, you know, into a different gear, so that you're looking at stuff. And, you know, we're all curious human beings, all of us, you know, whether you're in the communications team or, you know, not. And so actually to sort of feed that a little bit can be really good. And it's often in those moments where you're not even really thinking about the Christmas appeal you've got to do, you know, that you see something and it kind of it triggers an idea. So we definitely make that part of what we do. There are loads of sort of brands and charities. I mean, I know you work with Macmillan. I really like what Macmillan do. You know, and on lots of different levels. You know, you look at like other organisations, you think, well, like visual branding wise, they're really tight and they've kind of got a great control in a good way over all the different sort of touch points you see. But I'm really interested at the minute, or lately I've been really interested in the sort of B Corp companies. And I know we've got a mutual friend, Bird Sunglasses. And what I like about it is because it is flipping what I said at the beginning, where it's not like charities that are doing good. It's people that are delivering a product or a service, but they're doing it in such a way that it makes a difference.
Yeah.
You know, you know, Lawrence and his brothers want to make a living, right? They want to be able to pay the mortgage and pay for food and so on, but they want to do it in such a way that leaves the planet in a better way, and, you know, is sustainable, and aligns with people's values about kind of, you know, correct ways to, like, labor laws, you know, making sure that there's, you know, anti-trafficking and so on. And you think all these little things that actually they absolutely are part of the product process of that. And so what I really like is how that's part of their story, but in an authentic way. And so, like, brands like Finisterre, based down in Cornwall, you know, like Bird Sunglasses, like I've said, they have those values and those cultural attributes that obviously mean an awful lot to them, and it comes through authentically and simply through their brand, through their communications, through their website, you know, every sort of touch point. So I really like that. And then the content marketing that sits behind that I find really inspiring too, because actually I feel like I'm connecting to that brand, because we have shared values. And I think it's interesting because charities have that absolute gem. You know, we've got these great causes because we're doing stuff because we're motivated as individuals to do something over here. And actually all we're trying to do, when you strip back all the complication, is all we're trying to do is attract other people who have those same passions and interests, or even ignite those passions and interests in others, and say, do you want to come and join in? And so actually we've kind of got this rare, not even that rare, but we've got this great gem in the middle of it all, which is purpose. You know, Simon Sinek talks about the why, finding the why in your organization, and charities have kind of got that, or very nearly got that, by the bucket load, and often sort of like companies and, people that are pushing products or services, I try to find a way of, what is that why and what is that expression and how can we make that valuable for other people? And I feel like charities, we're really lucky that we've kind of got that. And it's more about, sometimes it's about getting out of the way. It's about stripping back all the complicated stuff and showing that kind of purpose in the middle of it all. I feel like sometimes we can overcomplicate it.
It's funny. I mean, talking about the purpose and the why, particularly in charities as well, it is a natural thing. It's why the charity exists in the first place. It's often from a fund or just a personal experience that somebody has gone through and said, I need to do something about this. So that why is fundamentally, intrinsically involved in the core of that organization, which is a great place to start. But they wouldn't necessarily always know what that is as a brand asset or anything like that, how to word it, how to frame
100%.
it. But in the charity sector particularly, you get organizations or charities with the same purpose or a very similar one.
Mm-hmm.
And how does brand help you differentiate outside of between one charity that's got one purpose, another that's got one very similar, because you don't want to be competing? Or do you compete as charities?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yes, on the basic level, charities compete because there is a finite amount of resource, I suppose, or sometimes in particular areas, but it's not quite the same. I mean, certainly there are other charities in our sector who, if they're sort of combating poverty and they eradicate extreme poverty in a particular country they're working in, perhaps even one that we're working in, we're not going to sit there and curse and say, "Oh man, can't believe they did that." We're going to celebrate that because ultimately we want the same things, and so it's competition, but not really, in the same way. At the place I used to work, we always used to talk about doing ourselves out of a job because we were about eradicating a particular issue. And that was always really interesting. We started, interesting. We were talking about it about 9 years ago, and then more recently we've seen that come through in a lot of like cancer research communications about kind of an end game and about reaching an end game. And actually, every donation or every kind of fundraising act that someone does, we're kind of moving that step closer. And so I've started to see that kind of come through in more organizations, communications. But I think that's at the heart of it. But in terms of differentiation, I think it can be really difficult because you've got to sort of sometimes, and it's not like static. You never kind of like establish, right, okay, this is our mission, and it's absolute. You've got to be focused and make sure you're not just deviating every now and again. But sometimes it just takes a bit of refining and being clear. What's our slice of this problem, and what is it specifically that we're good at? And sometimes that is a brand and communications matter. Other times it's not. It's one for the chief executive and the board, and it's sort of about positioning the business or the organization in the right place to say, actually, are we going to let go of that particular program because there's another organization that are doing that better and better, and our resources might be better focused here. But in terms of how it relates to brand and communications, it's the challenge is looking at what it is, the perception of our organisation in the minds of our supporters and would-be supporters. How do they see us? Is that positive? Is that what we want them to think, or is that potentially too close to other people? And is there a way that we can be really clear about what sets us apart? What slice of the problem we want them to help us to tackle? And then everything can flow from that in terms of your messaging and your visuals, and whether that's your choice of photography and so on. But yeah, I mean, it'd be naive to say there's sort of not a competitive element to it because you've got people have limited attention spans and there are limited resources, so there sometimes is a sort of a bit of a struggle to do that. But that's okay. That kind of stops people getting complacent and churning out mediocre comms or mediocre work, and keeps everyone on their toes. Certainly keeps us busy.
We've talked before about you mentioned photography just now, and how photography is a really key part of a brand in a lot of places, but particularly when you're talking about a situation that's happening far away from home, and particularly for compassion dealing with poverty, and how often there's dilemma of, do we show hard hitting imagery, video content that is really there to stir the emotions and drive giving? I know that compassion, just from looking at your website, makes it really clear that dignity is an important part of your brand, and of things, that the values that sit right through the organization. And you make a stand and say, we're not showing the flies in the eye sort of imagery that is there to do that. Is that something that you find that is a challenge to deal with? Does that differentiate you somehow?
Yeah, we're really we're very mindful um, of that side of things. I mean, I'm trying to work out where to start with it. In the sort of international development sector, it's been an ongoing kind of debate for years, really, in terms of image choice and how to portray people that we serve. And the reason it is probably ongoing is because there is data to show that kind of guilt-inducing, negative, showing the need type images can trigger action.
Yeah.
But it's whether it's the sort of action you want, and is it sustainable? That's the sort of the question. So there's always a tension. My old chief exec, Mark, who was brilliant in many ways, always used to put it really well in terms of, he said, we've got like a moral mandate to bear witness to the problem. You can't sort of sugarcoat it or gloss over it or kind of like make it palatable. But at the same time, you absolutely do not want to exploit the individuals this is their lived reality. And it is a tension, because living in poverty is not a bed of roses. It's horrible. And some of the stories from our graduates, it's not just even the sort of physical surroundings or lack of food. It's often Richmond, who's one of our graduates and is now a trustee of Compassion, talks about it as a complete lack of hope. And like, he would hear almost like a poverty whispering to him that he meant nothing, that there was no future, there was no point. And he said, actually, being released from poverty was more than just having the roof repaired or being fed. It was about having that hope breathed in again. And that is, that's not, there's so many complex angles to take on it, because it brings in like the white savior angle of, then, the wealthy Westerners are kind of like the hope bringers. And that's not it. And we absolutely do not, we're very sort of against that at Compassion. But the truth is, you've got to speak about the reality of poverty so that people can understand, or start to understand, that it's an issue that needs tackling. But at the same time, if you were to go the flies in the eyes route and all that sort of side of things, it completely, it can dehumanize the person you're talking about. And actually, this is a person you think, well, if I'm showing a photo of a child, would I want my child to be portrayed that way? Or actually, would I want them to be portrayed as a superhero, because they're railing against, they're so resilient to the things that we can't, living in Hampshire on the south coast of the UK, I can't get my head around what it's like to sort of not know where my next meal is coming from, or, the fact that if my mum is ill and can't work on a particular day, that probably means we're not eating for 2 days. I can't relate to that. And so that child, the resilience that they display, the fact that they kind of have a much more mature outlook because they have to be like more responsible. We want to it's not just about showing the transformation that, a Western sponsor can have. It's more about showing that this is a human being. This child is like full of potential. And actually there's a part that a sponsor in the West, but also like the local church in that particular community, the Compassion team there, a team that kind of come around, the parents of that child themselves, or the community that are around them. Everyone can play a little part to kind of realize the potential of that child. And so an image showing them in abject poverty, looking afraid and so on, might induce guilt and might induce someone to sort of throw some money at the problem to make that guilt go away. But it doesn't do much in terms of communicating the dignity and the humanity of that child. And it doesn't really allow us to begin a relationship with someone who might think, actually, I want to do something about that, and I don't just want to pay money at the problem, to make it go away. I want to begin that sort of slow, steady walk alongside this particular individual or an individual like them, to help them or to do my bit to help them over a number of years. And actually, that's part of it for us, is that because a big part of what we do is about child sponsorship, and that's often over a period of 7, 8, 9 plus years. We don't want to get people to take an immediate knee-jerk reaction. We want them to take their time and make a considered choice to say, actually, this is something I want to do. The kind of the image choice, which is just one small bit of it, is a key part of that, really. Sorry, slightly waffly answer, but there's
that's good.
I could bang on about that one for ages. It's such an emotive issue.
And it's an operational decision that you have to make and deal with day by day. And it's also a strategic decision that you've got to have a stance on. So it definitely fits into this comfortably. Are there instances where you can say, I could see direct impact of great design, great brand, maybe visual side of things has created a discernible or identifiable impact on the work you're trying to do? Like, any stories or examples along those lines? Either it could be within compassion, could be previous jobs.
So there are probably lots. I mean, one that leapt out as you were saying that, in terms of design in particular, was even just a website redevelopment. I say just, it was a big old beast in a previous role. And the reason I sort of gravitate to that as an example is, it ended up winning a design effectiveness award. So that's probably why it came into my head, because I was thinking, great, well, there's a little rubber stamp. It's not about like winning the awards or any of that, but actually it was the kind of the information around it, where we were kind of the agency that we'd worked with on that were quite keen to put it forward for a design effectiveness award. And it was all the work that went into sort of looking at, how well did it meet the brief? What was the uptick in kind of traffic, but also in terms of inquiries and all the things we'd set. And you could see, it was absolute open and shut. It was just a massive case for why it was worth the investment. And at the time, it was a significant investment for what was a small to medium sized charity to make. On the website, I think the previous website had been cobbled together in a couple of hours and it cost a few £100. And this was, a much bigger investment of time and money, and it was a difficult project. But the impact of the design, the graphic design, as well as all the information architecture and the kind of wireframing processes that we went through that were kind of painful at the time, but actually it hung together and it worked because we were so, we stuck to the brief so well, and we were very clear about what it was going to do, and particularly also what it wasn't going to do. Moving away from that whole thing of each team saying, well, my section on the website, it was just a website, but it forced a lot of really healthy and important conversations. And the upshot was that, there was a huge increase in terms of traffic, but also inquiries. And, as an organization that was looking for relationships with philanthropists over and above sort of, one-off small cash gifts or whatever, it generated lots of inquiries that way. So that was a really good one in terms of one that I've worked on. But it's the age-old debate, isn't it, about return on investment? People. I think as long as people see brand or design as something pretty, let's make this look pretty, let's make it eye-catching, let's make sure the logo doesn't get stretched, or let's make sure that the logo looks modern or whatever. If it's just seen as that, it's never really going to be a great return on investment. But if people are sort of seeing it as a really important expression of who we are and what we do, and it's got to be simple and consistent and authentic, then it's like a critical investment. You've got to. It's a bit like what I was saying earlier on. If you're not prepared, if you're doing great work and yet you're not prepared to invest in telling people about the fact that you are doing great work and they've got a fantastic opportunity to get involved with that, which great design does, then it's like a huge missed opportunity, really.
Just to finish with a quick one that I like to ask, which is, if you were asked for your advice by a smaller charity or a startup, um, where should they place their attention when it comes to their brand or their marketing and that sort of thing? What advice could you give them? Is there something that you would recommend from your experience that they should focus on first?
Um, I'm going to keep banging on this drum, even if it's boring. Which is in one of my previous roles, we were really lucky to go and spend some time with Richard Reed from Innocent. And many people point to Innocent when they talk about like tone of voice and design and just a great brand. And it was fantastic. But he said something really interesting when we were talking to him. He said, lead on values. I mean, it's a bit of a no-brainer. And like the brand values as being the values of the organization being the absolute underpinning of everything you do. And I know I've said that many times on this, but I think that's probably the place I would say you've got to start. And if you're in a small to medium-sized charity, the good news is actually you've got an advantage, because it's potentially less challenging to do that, because you haven't got to kind of communicate with all the offices around the rest of the world and try and sort of get a head of steam there. You potentially you could be a bit more nimble with that. And if you can start to help focus what they are, get those expressed clearly and start to sort of see them, build that understanding that everything you do either builds the brand or erodes the brand, then I think that's probably a really good place to start. I think in that same meeting, he quoted, is it Dan Walker? I think it was head of talent at Apple, who had said, have zero tolerance for those that don't live the values, because actually, the people around are kind of really important and powerful outworkings of that brand. And then I think someone said to him, what if I end up with a gap after sacking someone? And his response was, I'd rather have a hole than an arsehole. I thought that was really good. And the reason that stuck with me is because it underpinned to me, they say that, what is it, that Bezos quote about brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. And that is because the design of your posters and all those sorts of things are a key aspect of it, but so is like the phone conversation, so is everything else, so is the emails that people receive, so is the sort of, the thank you letter that they might or might not get. And so if you can lead with the values and start to shape what they are, and then almost like track out from there, well, if our values are about dignity and excellence, and if they are about kind of collaboration, what does that mean from a brand perspective, either visually or in our messaging, and then start to build out from that center? That feels like that's got to be a place to start. Otherwise, you're kind of working in the wrong direction. If you're getting everything looking fantastic, but it doesn't align with who you really are at the middle, then it's going to fall flat.
Yeah, there's a sense to say your principles have to matter to every stakeholder somehow, and what impact do those principles or values have on those stakeholders at whatever touch points, and then suddenly you've got a whole bucket load of ideas that can come from that, because
100%,
it's all authentic.
Yeah. And the other thing is, I mean, lots of organizations might have, quite similar, excellence tends to be a really, a very popular kind of value. And so get specific, if you've got ones in your organization, if you don't have them, then there's a great opportunity there. But if you have organizational values that are perhaps a bit more generic or a bit more like everyone else's, start to get granular. What is that? What is that? What do we do? What does that mean for us? If we have excellence as a value, what does that mean for this, and this? And actually start to sort of build that out and put flesh on the bones of it. And then I think actually it's almost, it comes from that, you've got that single organizing idea of who you are, what you do, and how you want to do it. And then everything else can kind of flow a bit more naturally from that. You haven't got to have huge budgets to be able to make a difference, and have like a brilliant brand. But if you haven't got a huge budget, you've got even less opportunities, to make that seen. And so you've got to make them count and make sure that each one of them shores up the other and tracks back to quite an authentic center.
It's authenticity, isn't it? That's what we're coming down to.
That's basically all I'm saying. So just that one word, cut everything else out. Just
I have a bit of a problem sometimes with corporate values, because I think if you're a solicitor and one of your corporate values is professional, then but you see it so often, and what does that mean? What, like, you wear suits? I mean, what does
Yeah.
that value mean? How is it? And it's fine to have that as a value, but you've got to know why it relates to your own brand, and not
Yeah.
just to fit into your industry.
Absolutely.
And values are so much, firstly, so much more important than that, but also so much more fun than that. You can have a
Yeah.
lot of fun coming, digging into those values to find out what really is the difference, because you'll have values that are very similar to another Christian charity.
Oh, massively. Like integrity, right? You'd
Yeah,
say, well, that should be an absolute given for a
of
charity,
course.
and it should. But it's what that means, and that's what I mean
Yeah,
about getting granular. Is then, well, how does that impact your recruitment? How does that impact, your messaging? How does that impact what you do in terms of your team and how you work with them? And it doesn't have to be a huge exercise, but you can start to to build that out, and then it becomes, like you say, it's fun and it's real, and actually it does make a difference to your daily life, because you think, well, actually, how, if our focus this week is on the value or the cultural attribute of being collaborative, what does that mean? If I'm sort of tempted to say, well, I'll go this bit alone, or I'll do this bit, actually, no, I'm going to, I'll change my behavior in a particular moment because of that value. If they don't genuinely guide what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, then they're probably not worth having.
and if you there can be good barometers for decisiveness in an organization. When you've
Yes.
got an opportunity to do something, you can look at it and say, well, we can evaluate that against our values. If we do this, how does that sit against this value, this value, this value? Maybe if it contradicts one, you can say, okay, how important is that when it actually aligns with some others? And it really helps you to know how to make strategic decisions and operational ones to
Yeah.
guide you going forwards, if you really know and understand it, and use
Yeah.
those as yardsticks. It's so much more, like you said, than a poster on the wall. I mean, I say
Yeah.
that we've got posters on the wall with our principles.
Yeah, but so have we. But obviously, if they're irrelevant, if people are like, oh, what are they again? And
Sure.
oh, that's the only time they see them, when they're going down that corridor towards the toilet. What's the point? They're there as reminders, as little aid memoirs that might just sort of trigger it. But the thing is, I think there's often a paralysis, isn't there, when it comes to looking at those sorts of things. Well, I'm working in the brand team, or I'm working in the comms team. I can't influence that. But I think you can do more than you realise. You haven't got to do it all, but you can. It might be that starting in that place. There's a guy who was a patron of our old charity. He's like an adventurer, and his thing was always like, think big, start small, but do start. And that's, I have that as a bit of a mantra, because I always get that sort of like, oh, there's so much to do, and I end up sort of not doing anything because of
Analysis paralysis.
analysis paralysis. And so actually, it's almost like, well, what bit of it can I affect? And if you can't sort of change all the HR stuff, you start to think, well, actually, fine. If we've got organizational values, well, then I'll start to build that out, what it looks like in my team, and free yourself from this sort of thing and think, well, I've got to tackle it all. But if you know that that's, you want to try and get consistency and authenticity about those, well, let's at least sort of get those right in our communication, and hopefully that'll be a good inspiration for others, or you can start to sort of influence others in the organization to do it that way too. But I do think, it's important that authenticity is there. Otherwise, it's just a bit of a fool's errand.
Definitely. Brilliant. Thanks, Steve. Really appreciate taking your time this morning, and I'll let you get on with your day. But thank you so much for your insight, and I will look forward to seeing what the response is when we put this out there.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thanks, mate. Have a
mate.
good rest of the day. Bye.
Cheers.
Cool. How's that?
Oh, mate, sorry, I was wanging on.
No, it was interesting.